Hyperpilosity by L. Sprague de Camp. I first knew J. Roman Oliveira when I was a mere student at the medical center. He was a professor of virology. The J in his name stands for Jesus, spelled Jesus, which is a perfectly good Mexican name. But he'd been so much kidded about it in the States that he preferred to go by Roman. You remember that the Great Change, which is what this story has to do with, started in the winter of 1971 with that awful flu epidemic. Oliveira came down with it, and I went around to see him to get an assignment, and found him perched on a pile of pillows and wearing the awfulest pink and green pajamas. His wife was reading to him in Spanish. "Listen, Pat," he said when I came in. "I know you're a worthy student, but I wish you and the whole biology class were roasting on the hot griddle in hell. Tell me what you want, and then go away, and let me die in peace." I got my information and was just going when his doctor came in. Old Fogarty, who used to lecture on sinuses. He'd given up GP long before, but he was so scared of losing a good virologist that he was handling Oliveira's case himself. "Stick around, Sonny," he said to me when I started to follow Mrs. Oliveira out, "and learn a little practical medicine. I've always thought it was a mistake that we haven't a class to train doctors in bedside manners. Now observe how I do it. I smile at Oliveira here, but I don't act so cheerful that he'd find death a welcome relief from my company. That's a mistake some young doctors make. Notice that I walk up briskly, and not as if I were afraid my patient was liable to fall in pieces at the slightest jar." And so on. The fun came when he put the end of his stethoscope on Oliveira's chest. "I can't hear a thing," he snorted. "Or rather, you've got so much hair there, all I can hear is the ends of it scraping on the diaphragm. May have to shave it. But say, isn't that rather unusual for a Mexican?" "You're jolly well right she is," retorted the sufferer. "Like most natives of my beautiful Mexico, I am mostly Indian descent, and Indians are of Mongoloid race, and so have little body hair. It's all come out in the last week." "That's funny," Fogarty said. I spoke up. "Say, Dr. Fogarty, it's more than that. I had my flu a month ago, and the same thing's been happening to me. I've always felt like a sissy because of not having any hair on my torso to speak of. Now I've got a crop that's almost long enough to braid. I didn't think anything special about it." I don't remember what was said next, because we all talked at once. But when we got calmed down, there didn't seem to be anything we could do without some systematic investigation. I promised Fogarty to come around to his place so he could look me over. I did, the next day. But he didn't find anything except a lot of hair. He took samples of everything he could think of course. I'd given up wearing underwear because it itched, and anyway, the hair was warm enough to make it unnecessary, even in a New York January. The next thing I heard was a week later, when Oliveira returned to his classes and told me that Fogarty had caught the flu. Oliveira had been making observations on the old boy's thorax and found that he too had begun to grow body hair at an unprecedented rate. Then my girlfriend, not the present Mrs., overcame her embarrassment enough to ask me whether I could explain how it was that she was getting hairy. I could see that the poor girl was pretty badly cut up about it, because obviously her chances of catching a good man would be reduced by her growing a pelt like a bear or a gorilla. I wasn't able to enlighten her, but told her that if it was any comfort, a lot of other people were suffering from the same thing. Then we heard that Fogarty had died. He was a good egg, and we were sorry. But he led a pretty full life. You couldn't say that he was cut off in his prime. Oliveira called me to his office. "Pat," he said, "you were looking for a job last fall, is it not? Well, I need an assistant. We're going to find out about this hair business. Are you in?" I was. We started by examining all the clinical cases. Everybody who had or had had the flu was growing hair. And it was a severe winter, and it looked as though everybody were going to have the flu sooner or later. Just about that time, I had a bright idea. I looked up all the cosmetic companies that made depilatories and soaked what little money I had into their stock. I was sorry later on, but I'll come to that. Roman Oliveira was a glutton for work, and with the hours he made me keep, I began to have uneasy visions of flunking out. But the fact that my girlfriend had become so self-conscious about her hair that she wouldn't go out anymore saved me some time. We worked and worked over our guinea pigs and rats, but didn't get anywhere. Oliveira got a bunch of hairless Chihuahua dogs and tried assorting gunks on them, but nothing happened. He even got a pair of East African sand rats, heterocephalus, hideous-looking hairless things, but that was a blank too. Then the business got into the papers. I noticed a little article in the New York Times on an inside page. A week later, there was a full column story on page 1 of the second part. Then it was on the front page. It was mostly Dr. So-and-so says he thinks this nationwide attack of hyperpilosity is due to this, that, or the other thing. Swell word, huh? Wish I could remember the name of the doc who invented it. Our usual February dance had to be called off because almost none of the students could get their girls to go. Attendance to the movie houses had fallen off pretty badly for much the same reason. It was a cinch to get a good seat, even if you arrived around 8 p.m. I noticed one funny little item in the paper to the effect that the filming of Tarzan and the Octopus Men had to be called off. The company found that they had to clip and shave the cast all over every few days if they didn't want the actors and the gorillas confused. It was fun to ride on a bus about then and watch the people who were pretty well bundled up. Most of them scratched, and those who were too well bred to scratch just squirmed and looked unhappy. Next, I read that application for marriage licenses had fallen off, so that 3 clerks were able to handle the entire business for Greater New York, including Yonkers, which had just been incorporated into the Bronx. I was gratified to see that my cosmetic stocks were going up nicely. I tried to get my roommate, Bert Cathcart, to get in on them too, but he just smiled mysteriously and said he had other plans. Bert was a kind of professional pessimist. "Pat," he said, "maybe you and Oliveira will lick this business and maybe not. I'm betting that you won't. If I win, the stocks that I've bought will be doing famously long after your depilatories are forgotten." As you know, people were pretty excited about the plague, but when the weather was warm, the fun really started. First, the 4 big underwear companies ceased operations, one after another. 2 of them were placed in receivership, and another liquidated completely, and the 4th was able to pull through by switching to the manufacturing of tablecloths and American flags. The bottom dropped completely out of the cotton market, and this alleged hair-growing flu spread all over the world by now. Congress had been planning to go home early and was, as usual, being urged to do so by the conservative newspapers. But now Washington was jammed with cotton planters demanding that the government do something, and they didn't dare. The government was willing enough to do something, but unfortunately didn't have the foggiest idea of how to go about it. All this time, Oliveira more or less assisted me by working night and day on the problem. But we didn't seem to have any better luck than the government. You couldn't hear anything on the radio in the building where I lived because of the interference from the big, powerful electric clippers that everybody had installed and kept going all the time. It was an ill wind, as the prophet saith, and Bert Cathcart got some good out of it. His girl, whom he had been pursuing for some years, had been making a good salary as a model at Josephine Lyon's exclusive dress establishment on Fifth Avenue, and she had been leading Bert a dance. But now, all of a sudden, the Lyon place folded up, and nobody seemed to be buying any clothes, and the girl was only too glad to take Bert as her lawful wedded husband. Not much hair was grown on the women's faces, fortunately for them, or God knows what would have become of the race. Bert and I flipped a coin to see which of us should move, and I won. Congress finally passed a bill setting up a reward of $1 million for whoever should find a permanent cure for hyperpilosity, and then adjourned, having as usual left a flock of important bills not acted upon. When the weather became really hot in June, all the men quit wearing shirts, as their pelts covered them quite as effectively. The police force kicked so about having to wear their regular uniforms that they were soon allowed to go around in dark blue polo shirts and shorts. But pretty soon, They were rolling up their shirts and sticking them in the pockets of their shorts. It wasn't long before the rest of the male population of the United States was doing likewise. In growing hair, the human race hadn't lost any of its capacity to sweat, and you'd pass out with the heat if you tried to walk anywhere on a hot day. I can still remember holding on to a hydrant at 3rd Avenue and 6th Street, trying not to faint, with the sweat pouring out the ankles of my pants and the buildings going round and round. After that, I was sensible and stripped down to shorts like everyone else. In July, Natasha, the gorilla in the Bronx Zoo, escaped from her cage and wandered around the park for 3 hours before anyone noticed her. The zoo visitors all thought she was merely an unusually ugly member of their own species. If the hair played hob with the textile and clothing business generally, the market for silk simply disappeared. Stockings were just quaint things that our ancestors had worn, like cocked hats and periwigs. One result was that the economy of the Japanese Empire, always a pretty shaky proposition, went completely to pot, which is how they had a revolution, and are now a socialist Soviet republic. Neither Oliviera nor I took any vacation that summer, as we were working like fury on the hair problem. Roman promised me a cut of the reward when and if he won it, but we didn't get anywhere at all during the summer. When my classes started, we had to slow down a bit on the research, as I was in my last year, and Oliviera had to teach. But we kept at it as best we could. It was funny to read the editorials in the papers. The Chicago Tribune even suspected a red plot. You can imagine the time that the cartoonists for the New Yorker and Esquire had. With the drop of the price in cotton, the South was really flat on its back this time. I remember when the Harwick Bill was introduced in Congress to require every citizen over the age of 5 to be clipped at least once a week. A bunch of Southerners were back at it, of course. When that was defeated, largely on the argument of unconstitutionality, the Ualls put forward one requiring every person to be clipped before he'd be allowed to cross a state line. The theory was that human hair is a commodity, which it is sometimes, and that crossing a state line with a coat of the stuff, whether your own or someone else's, constituted interstate commerce and brought you under the control of the federal government. It looked for a while as though it would pass, but the Southerners finally accepted a substitute bill requiring all federal employees and cadets at the military and naval academies to be clipped. About this time, in the autumn of 1971, the cotton and textile interests got out a big advertising campaign to promote clipping. They had slogans such as, "Don't be a hairy ape," and pictures of a couple of male swimmers, one with hair and the other without, and a pretty girl turning in disgust from the hairsuit swimmer and fairly pouncing on the clipped one. I don't know how much good their campaign would have done, but they overplayed their hand. They and all the clothing outfits tried to insist on boiled shirts, not only for evening wear, but for daytime wear as well. I never thought a long-suffering people would really revolt against the tyrant style, but we did. The thing that really tore it was the inauguration of President Passavant. There was an unusually warm January thaw that year, and the president, the VP, and all the justices of the Supreme Court appeared without a stitch on above the waist, and little below. We became a nation of confirmed near nudists, just as did everybody else sooner or later. The one drawback to real nudism was the fact that, unlike marsupials, man hadn't any natural pockets. So we compromised between the hair, the need for something to hold fountain pens, money, and so forth, and our traditional idea of modesty, by adopting an up-to-date version of the Scottish sporran. The winter was a bad one for flu, and everybody who hadn't caught it the preceding winter got it now. Soon, a hairless person became such a rarity that one wondered if the poor fellow had the mange. In May of 1972, we finally began to get somewhere. Oliviera figured out that the cause of hyperpilosity was what he'd suspected all along, another of these self-perpetuating protein molecules. As you know, you can't see a protein molecule, and you can't do much with it chemically because, if you do, it forthwith ceases to be a protein molecule. We have their structure worked out pretty well now, but it's been a slow process with lots of interferences from inadequate data. Sometimes the inferences were right and sometimes they weren't. But to do much in the way of detailed analysis of the things, you need a respectable quantity of them. And these that we were after didn't exist, even in a disrespectable amount. Then, Olivier worked out his method of counting them. The reputation he made from that method is about the only permanent thing he got out of all his work. When we applied the method, we found something decidedly screwy. An ectogen's virus count, after catching Hyperpil, was the same as it had been before. That didn't seem right. We knew that he had been injected with Hyperpil molecules and had come out with a fine mattress as a result. Then one morning, I found Olivier at his desk, looking like a medieval monk who had just seen a vision after a 40-day fast. Incidentally, you try fasting that long, and you'll see visions too. Lots of them. He said, "Pat, don't buy a yacht with your share of the million. They cost too much to upkeep." "Huh?" was the brightest remark I could think of. "Look here," he said, going to the blackboard. It was covered with chalk diagrams of protein molecules. "We have 3 proteins, alpha, beta, and gamma. No alphas have existed for thousands of years. Now you will note that the only difference between alpha and the beta is that these nitrogens," he pointed, "are hooked onto this chain instead of that one. You will also observe, from the energy relations written down here, that if one beta is introduced into a set of alphas, all the alphas will presently turn into betas. Now we know that all sorts of protein molecules are being assembled inside of us all the time. Most of them are unstable and break up again, or are inert and harmless, or lack of the power of self-production. Anyway, nothing happens because of them, but because they are so big and complicated. The possible forms they take are very many, and it is possible that once in a long time some new kind of protein appears with self-producing qualities. In other words, a virus. Probably that's how the various disease viruses got started, all because something juggled an ordinary protein molecule that was just being finished and got the nitrogens hooked on the wrong chain. My idea is this. The alpha protein, which I have reconstructed from what we know about its descendants, beta and gamma, once existed as a harmless and inert protein molecule in the human body. Then one day, somebody hiccuped as one of them was being formed, and presto, we had a beta. But the beta is not harmless. It reproduces itself fast and inhibits the growth of hair on most of our bodies. So presently, all our species, which at the time was pretty apish, catch this virus and lose their hair. Moreover, it is one of the viruses that is transmitted to the embryo, so the new babies don't have hair either. Well, our ancestors shiver a while and then learn to cover themselves with animal skins to keep warm and also to keep fire. And so, the march of civilizations it is commence. Just think, except for that one original beta protein molecule, we should probably today all be merely a kind of gorilla or chimpanzee. Anyway, an ordinary anthropod ape. Now, I figured that what has happened is that another change in the form of the molecule has taken place, changing it from beta to gamma. And gamma is a harmless and inert little fellow like alpha. So, we are back where we started. Our problem, yours and mine, is to find out how to turn the gammas with which we were all swarming back into betas. In other words, now that we have become all of a sudden cured of the disease that was endemic in the whole race for thousands of years, we want our disease back again. And I think I see how it can be done. I couldn't get much more out of him. We went to work harder than ever. After several weeks, he announced that he was ready to experiment on himself. His method consisted of a combination of a number of drugs. One of them was the standard cure for glanders in horses, as I recall, and a high-frequency electromagnetic fever. I wasn't very keen about it, because I'd gotten to like the fellow, and that awful dose he was going to give himself looked enough to kill a regiment. But he went right ahead. Well, it nearly did kill him. But after 3 days, he was more or less back to normal, and was whooping at the discovery that the hair on his limbs and body was rapidly falling out. In a couple of weeks, he had no more hair than you'd expect a Mexican professor of virology to have. But then our real surprise came, and it wasn't a pleasant one. We expected to be more or less swamped by publicity, and had made our preparations accordingly. I remember staring into Oliviera's face for a full minute, and then reassuring him that he had trimmed his mustache to exact symmetry, and getting him to straighten up my new necktie. Our epic-making announcement dug up 2 personal calls from bored reporters, a couple of phone interviews from science editors, and not one photographer. We did make the science section of New York Times, but with only about 12 lines of type. The paper merely stated that Professor Oliviera and his assistant, not named, had found the cause and cure of hyperpilosity. Not a word about the possible effects of the discovery. Our contracts with the medical center prohibited us from exploring our discovery commercially, but we expected that plenty of other people would be quick to do so as soon as the method was made public. But it didn't happen. In fact, we might have discovered a correlation between temperature and the pitch of the bullfrog's croak for all the splash we made. A week later, Oliviera and I talked to the department head Wheelock about the discovery. Oliviera wanted him to use his influence to get a deherring clinic set up, but Wheelock couldn't see it. "We've had a couple of inquiries," he admitted, "but nothing to get excited about. Remember the rush there was when the Zimmerman cancer treatment came out? Well, there's been nothing like that. In fact, I doubt whether I personally should care to undergo your treatment. Surefire though it may be, Dr. Oliviera, I'm not in the least disparaging the remarkable piece of work you've done, but—" Here he ran his fingers through the hair on his chest, which was over 6 inches long, thick, and a beautiful silky white. "You know, I've gotten rather fond of the old pelt, and I'd feel slightly indecent back in my bare skin. Also, it's a lot more economical than a suit of clothes, and, if I may say so with due modesty, I don't think it's bad looking. My family has always ridden me about my sloppy clothes, but now the laugh's on them. Not one of them can show a coat of fur like mine." Oliviera and I left sagging in the breeches a bit. We inquired of people we knew, and wrote letters to a number of them, asking what they thought of the idea of undergoing the Oliviera treatment. A few said they might, if enough others did, but most of them responded in much the same vein that Doc Wheelock had. They had gotten used to their hair, and saw no good reason for going back to their former glabrous state. "So, Pat," said Oliviera to me, "it looks like we don't have much fame out of our discovery, but we may still salvage a little fortune. You remember the $1 million reward? I sent in my application as soon as I recovered from my treatment, and we should hear from the government any day." We did. I was up at his apartment when we were talking about nothing in particular, when Mrs. O rushed in with the letter, squeaking, open it, Roman." He opened it without hurry, spread the sheet of paper out, and read it. Then he frowned, and read it again. Then he laid it down very carefully, took out and lit the wrong end of a cork-tipped cigarette, and said in his levelest voice, "I have been stupid again, Pat. I never thought that there might be a time limit on that reward offer. Now it seems that some crafty Salamagoon in Congress put one in, and that the offer expired on May 1st. You may remember, I mailed the claim on the 19th, and they got it on the 21st, 3 weeks too late." I looked at Oliviera, and he looked at me, and then at his wife, and she looked at him, and then went without a word to the cabinet, and got out 2 large bottles of tequila and 3 tumblers. Oliviera pulled up 3 chairs around a little table, and settled with a sigh in on one of them. "Pat," he said, "I may not have $1 million, but I have something more valuable by far, a woman who knows what is needed at a time like this." And that's the inside story of the Great Change, or at least one aspect thereof. That's how it happened that when we speak today of a platinum blonde movie star, we aren't referring to her scalp hair alone, but the beautiful silvery pelt that covers her from crown to ankle. There was just one more incident. Bert Cathcart had me up to his place to dinner a few nights later. after I had told him and his wife about Oliviera's and my troubles. He asked me how I had made out on that depilatory manufacturer's stock I'd bought. I noticed those stocks are back about where they started from before the change, he added. Didn't make anything to speak of, I told him. About the time they started to slide down from their peak, I was too busy working for Roman to pay much attention to him. When I finally did look them up, I was just able to unload with a few cents profit per share. How did you do on those stocks you were so mysterious about last year? Maybe you noticed my new car as you came in, asked Bert with a grin. That's them. Or rather, there was only one. Jones and Galloway Company. What do Jones and Galloway make? I never heard of them. They make... Here Bert's grin looked as if it were going to run around his head and meet behind. Curry combs.